Esteemed guests and colleagues, good morning, and thank you for joining us at the Amrit Center for Strategic Studies and Research. We are delighted to welcome you today to this conversation centering on the impact of the outcome of the US elections on the geopolitical environment in the Middle East and the incoming administration's approach towards the region as a whole. We are privileged to be joined today by Mr. Jason Isaacson, as well as Ambassador Mark Sievers, former U.S. Ambassador to Oman, and the current director of the Sydney Lerner Center for Arab-Jewish Understanding in Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Mr. Isaacson.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. To give a brief about our guest speaker, Mr. Isaacson is the Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer at the American Jewish Committee and is a longtime analyst of U.S. political and strategic affairs, as well as an advocate for Arab-Israeli peace. He was an observer to the 1991 and 92 Middle East peace talks held in Madrid, Moscow, and Washington, and has coordinated periodic ministerial meetings throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and Asia. He has lectured periodically at the Diplomatic Institute of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry and the Jordan Institute of Diplomacy. And in 2002, he was a senior visitor at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. In July 2009, King Mohammed VI bestowed on Mr. Isaacson the honor of Chevalier of the Order of the Throne of the Kingdom of Morocco. Again, it's a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Isaacson. The format of this closed session will be as follows. The first part will consist of main questions directed by myself to our guest, and afterwards, the floor will be open to the audience. To begin, allow me to ask the question on everyone's mind. How will the new U.S. administration approach the resolution of the Gaza crisis? What would the contours of a deal look like or consist of? And what is the degree of willingness inside Israel itself to accept such a deal?
Well, thank you for starting out with an easy question. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back at ECSSR. I've been to ECSSR many times over the years, but never in this magnificent ballroom that you have, Dr. Sultan. This is tremendously impressive. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this program. Now, you're asking a very difficult question, of course, as you know. My expectation is that the war between Israel and Hamas will not end anytime very soon. It is clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu is intent, and this is, I think, the will of the Israeli public, to make sure that the threat posed by Hamas is ended. That this whole phrase, enough is enough, is very much on the minds of many in the Israeli public because of the appalling atrocities that were created on October 7th and the depth of trauma that has inflicted on the people of Israel. And they are not willing to go back to these repeated cycles of ceasefires and suppressing launches of rockets and missiles into Israel, only to have it repeat again and again and again. They want to end it. And the question is, at what point is it sufficient to say the threat is so vastly diminished, if not completely eliminated, that they can relax and pull out of Gaza, return to their positions in Israeli territory proper. And I don't know when we're going to reach that point, but I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. But there will be a day after, of course. And the role that the Trump administration will play in the day after, and the role, frankly, that the United Arab Emirates and other friends of the Palestinian cause, but also friends of Israel, what they will play is a huge question and something that we're quite interested in. And we've been engaging people here and in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain and in Egypt and in Jordan to try to get a sense of that, as well as the outgoing Biden administration and even to some extent people who we know will be part of the incoming Trump administration. So my expectation is that sometime in the coming months, but not tomorrow, there will be a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the main part of Gaza, but they will still be on the periphery of Gaza. And there will have to be some kind of a mechanism established in which the Palestinian Authority, as much as Israel has no confidence in the Palestinian Authority, there is no substitute for having some sort of Palestinian Authority role in cooperation with, frankly, friendly, moderate, well-intentioned states such as the United Arab Emirates and perhaps others, to provide some kind of a civil administration and possibly even a law enforcement mechanism in Gaza to suppress resurgent Hamas elements and other terrorist elements, and provide some stability and some ability to then begin the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, there are many plans that maybe you've seen floated around. There was a day after proposal that was put together by the Wilson Center in cooperation with the Atlantic Council. Perhaps you saw something about that several months ago. We've had briefings on that with people from the Wilson Center and Atlantic Council. And there are other ideas that are around. But it's unavoidable that there will be a Palestinian Authority role in this. Israel will get over that because they have to. It will not necessarily be people appointed by Mahmoud Abbas. It may be people who have been associated with the PA over the years. The role that the United States will play, the physical role, the tangible role, on the ground role, is unclear. Clearly, there is no desire on the part of the outgoing administration or the incoming administration to have American boots on the ground in Gaza. I think the American public would not support that, and there are no signs at all from the incoming administration that they'd be interested in that at all. But some kind of administrative oversight role, some kind of role of kind of corralling the necessary forces, but not actually physically being there, I think that is a role that the United States could properly play. And then, of course, the big question is, how do you provide stability and reconstruction in the absence of a political path toward autonomy for the Palestinian people, self-governance for the Palestinian people, in a way that doesn't threaten the security of Israel? This is something that AJC has spent a lot of time examining and discussing with people in Israel and elsewhere across the region. We've actually issued a paper, and I'll provide that to you if you have not seen it, our 10 principles of the day after, and finding a way forward to a more peaceful, stable future for the region. And it involves recognizing that there has to be, ultimately, self-governance for the Palestinian people. It's clear from the signals that we've heard from so many, including Saudi officials with whom we've been discussing this as recently as last week, the word state has to somehow be spoken from Jerusalem, even though there is great hesitation, great reluctance, particularly in light of the trauma of October 7th, to have the confidence that a Palestinian state will not threaten the Jewish state of Israel, majority Jewish state of Israel. But that's the direction that this has to take. There has to be a political path. It can't just be a military solution. We can't just leave things as they are. Whether there can be Palestinian statehood in the next 2 years or 3 years or 4 years is a big question. My guess is no, but that doesn't mean there can't be a path to statehood. That certain conditions must be met on the way to that achievement. But I don't know how we avoid it. And I think even though there's enormous still trauma in Israel and still lack of confidence that there can be faith that a Palestinian state will not threaten Israel, many people in policy circles recognize that there has to be the recognition that down the road, that's the objective that they should be pursuing. That's certainly the way we feel. But you have to have a Palestinian entity that is not supporting, valorizing martyrdom, that is not saying that the way to achieve victory and success is to kill Jews. That has to be over. The narrative has to be, this is their land as much as it's our land. We have to share this land. They have a legitimate right to be there. We have a legitimate right to be there. This is, I'm speaking in the voice of the Palestinians who live there. They've lived there for generations. Jews have lived there for generations, for centuries, for millennia. We have to share the land. It's not the exclusive province of one people. They're both indigenous. When you hear that kind of recognition throughout society, it will change the dynamic. A democratic Israel is not going to give up control over the territory that abuts them until they have the assurance that those people are not intent on driving them into the sea. We can develop that trust. We can develop the narrative that recognizes the indigenous rights of two people. It shouldn't be impossible to create that environment. We are committed to it. The United States government, under President Biden, and I expect under President Trump, will be committed to creating that kind of environment. And that's what we're going to be promoting as in our continued discussions with the new administration. That was a much longer answer than you expected, but thank you for allowing me the time to do that.
It was an extremely comprehensive answer. Thank you for your insight. Just to build on what you said, do you think this is the pragmatic position that you laid out, the realistic option? But in light of what Professor Ilan Pappé has termed the state of Judea, taking over the state of Israel from inside, namely the more right-wing, hardline elements inside the state of Israel that are not willing to part with the land, that are not willing to cede an inch or a hill. Do you think that the pragmatic position will be able to win out in the long term, despite the shifts that Israeli society inside is showing?
Well, that's a tough question. I can't say I know for sure. There are changes demographically in Israel that you're aware of as well that are likely to move the political conversations toward the right. But there's the practical reality that the Palestinian people are not going to disappear. They're always going to be there, and they're going to be in roughly equal numbers. And it is not possible to envision 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now, an absence of a political resolution, an absence of self-governance, of autonomy for the Palestinian people, in a way that does not threaten the state of Israel. So I know that there are those voices, and they're extreme. I would even say that they're racist. But it's based on a sense of two things. It's based on, first of all, the fears that are not illegitimate of what could happen if guns are given to, and heavier weapons are given to their neighbors who very much want to destroy them. And also a religious sense that God gave us this land, therefore it is ours alone. People have all sorts of assumptions of what God intended. God put us all here, mixed in this land and in that land. It is a strange interpretation of God's will that the intention was that this is just yours and no one else is allowed to be here. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It makes sense to some people. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think that will prevail. I think the good sense of the Israeli people will prevail. But there will be extreme voices. It's a democracy. Our country also has crazy extreme voices. But generally, the will of the public prevails. But there will be a contest, and it will help provide a positive resolution to this contest if the moderate voices from across the region, not only from within the Palestinian community, but from across the region, give encouragement to those in Israel who want a more peaceful, more stable, more collaborative path. I'm counting on the good sense, particularly of the leadership of this great country, to help provide that incentive and that model for how you can engage your neighbor and not want to just drive your neighbor away.
To pivot east a little bit, what will the Trump administration's approach to the current Israel-Iran standoff consist of? More of maximum pressure, or a willingness to cut deals, given what some would characterize as a pliant or an acquiescent Iran?
Well, you're asking me to predict Donald Trump, and that's really, who can do that? Because of course you can point to different models in the record of the first Trump administration of bold, decisive action, the assassination of, or the killing of General Soleimani, one example. Negotiating with the Taliban. In fact, I guess there was a plan to maybe even invite Taliban leadership to Camp David, a different kind of a model. So talking to terrorists, people you would classify as terrorists, or destroying them. Clearly the Trump administration 1.0 had a very tough line on Iran. They pulled out of the JCPOA after initially trying over the course of a year and a half or 2 years to bring the Europeans, the E3, on board with an enhanced JCPOA. Brian Hook led that effort, negotiating with British and German and French authorities to see if they could come up with something that would address the issues that were not addressed in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the missile programs of Iran and on Iranian support for proxies for terrorist groups across the region. Those were left out of the JCPOA negotiations because the American sense, and it wasn't illegitimate, was that they weren't going to go anywhere with the Iranians if they focused on these other issues. They had to just focus on the nuclear file. But that's been a flaw. We always knew that that was a flaw, but apparently it was as far as they thought they could go. Whether we would see in a second Trump administration a return to that kind of drive for enhanced negotiating strategy, I was about to say enhanced JCPOA, but I think the JCPOA is dead and gone, and we're not going to see it come back, and maybe we shouldn't even use the words anymore. But there is a desire, clearly on the part of some in the Trump orbit, to have a deal. Trump is famous for wanting a deal on everything, and so on this as well. And you've heard from Vice President-elect Vance and others in that orbit a lack of desire to have a military solution, or at least not an American-led military solution. I think that there would be some acceptance of a military solution that did not involve America fighting itself. But it is clear from the conversations that I've had with people who are close to the Trump team that there's a recognition that the Iranian problem has to be solved in a way that it has been allowed to fester. Again, there's an enough is enough sense about this as well, because after all, it all comes back to the same sources in many ways. So I do expect maximum pressure 2.0 with the intention of driving toward a deal, more than I expect a path toward a supposed military solution. Although one hears those voices as well, because the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, has different voices from different quarters, some more hawkish, some more willing to entertain the idea of, look, their defenses are down, their proxies are weakened, their anti-missile, anti-aircraft batteries have been destroyed. This is the time to finish once and for all the nuclear program. I don't think that that's the impulse of Donald Trump. But again, you're asking anyone to predict the impulses of Donald Trump. It's difficult. My guess is there'll be a drive toward squeezing Iran as hard as possible, trying to impose snapback, urging the Germans, French, British to take that option that is still before them, as according to the Security Council resolution that supported the JCPOA. And then with that additional pressure on the economy, on the missile program, on other aspects of trade with Iran, hoping that there could be a political solution.
To get a view from
by the way, I should say,
sure, please.
There was also this report, as you saw a couple of weeks ago, about Elon Musk meeting with the Iranian ambassador. It's been denied. It may have happened. Is that another sign that there is a desire, at least on the part of some people surrounding Donald Trump, for a political path forward? It seems that way.
Now, to get a view from the other side, what will the Israeli government's position toward any potential U.S. deal with Iran be? Or to rephrase the question, what kind of deal would be acceptable to Israel?
Well, first of all, let's pause and give credit to Israel for doing so much to weaken the Iranian proxies. I would love to hear more signs of more applause, frankly, from a region that is itself threatened by Iran for the very decisive, very creative, really actually ingenious means that Israel has employed to severely weaken the Iranian threat, not only to Israel, but to this region. Israel wants to live in peace with all its neighbors. They can no longer tolerate having on so many fronts, 7 fronts, Iranian threats through proxies and through Iran itself. Would Israel be accepting of a negotiated settlement that reduces significantly, if not eliminates, the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, and also a withdrawal of support for proxies, something that eliminates the missile or stops the further development of the ballistic missile program of Iran? Yeah, I think so. But there's a desire on the part of Israel as well, going back to what I said earlier so many times about enough is enough. They can no longer tolerate the idea of being squeezed by an Iranian regime that is intent on its destruction. And if the answer is either a military solution to the nuclear capabilities of Iran and the missile capabilities of Iran, or some kind of a diplomatic effort that results in inspections returning and making sure that the huge stockpile of highly enriched uranium is eliminated and the very sophisticated centrifuges are no longer put online or are dismantled, and other aspects of weapons research are eliminated. If all of that can happen as part of a big package deal, I think that would be satisfactory to Israel. I don't know if if they're capable of reaching that point. The Iranians are master negotiators. Will they so significantly disarm and prevent the future arming of their country to satisfy the pressure that's being put on them by the United States and perhaps other countries as well? I don't know. My guess is they'll try to find ways around that, that they will be sneaky, and whether that's satisfactory to an Israel that has been so severely threatened and hurt by Iran, I just don't know the answer to that. But there will be a desire on the part of Israel for a much more definitive resolution to this problem than we have ever had, based on the trauma inflicted on October 7th and the continuing threats from the Houthis, from the militias in Iraq and Syria, from Hezbollah, which is not eliminated. It's been severely weakened, but not eliminated. And of course from Hamas. So we're in a very difficult period right now. And again, I want to go back to the important role that this country plays in helping point to a path forward, a path for a more peaceful region, a more peaceful future, a more prosperous future, a more cooperative future. And I hope that will somehow give encouragement to those in Israel who will look to a different way of negotiating with the Palestinians, but also a different way of cooperating against the common threats that Israel faces along with this region.
It is indeed a difficult period, not just for Israel or Iran or Gaza, but also for the neighborhood. more generally.
Yes.
In a conversation this past September with the Baker Institute, you noted that Arab governments, and I quote, stayed on course and showed commitment to the Abraham Accords, despite what is happening in Gaza. So, allow me to ask you, what is Israel showing or giving in return, other than what some may characterize as ingratitude? Beyond ingratitude, some are even making the accusation that they're feeding radicalism on the long term and thus threatening Arab countries, not building healthy societies in the region.
If you're asking what Israel is doing in response to the gestures made by the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco to create a normal political relationship with Israel and an economic relationship with Israel, what is Israel doing to resolve an issue that has troubled the region for 70 years? It's a complicated question. And to ask Israel to completely relax and accept the necessity of Palestinian statehood, knowing that at least half the Palestinian population would probably prefer a much harder line approach toward Israel, a Hamas approach toward Israel, a rejectionist approach, a river to the sea approach. Knowing the history of Israel's relationship with countries across the region before 2020, a cold peace with Egypt since 1979, a cold peace with Jordan since 1994, important relations, obviously, very important strategic relations, but popular hostility toward Israel among the public. From an Israeli perspective, tiny country surrounded by people who hate them. I'm cutting down to the very core feeling that you could understand the people of Israel would have based on what they see in the media, based on the polls that they've seen from across the region for decades, the propaganda for decades, the UN resolutions for decades that single out Israel alone among the countries in the world as the greatest human rights violator when terrible human rights violations take place across the region. There's a feeling of constantly being microscopically criticized and condemned and threatened, not to mention the actual threats, not to mention the actual attacks. So from an Israeli perspective, feeling surrounded in this way, there was a huge breakthrough, a bolt of lightning from 2020 when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed took this enormously historic, brave step to move forward toward normalization with Israel, followed by the King of Bahrain, followed some months later by the King of Morocco. It did start to change the mindset of many in Israel who felt that they could imagine a different future, and a future that would also allow for perhaps a different relationship with the Palestinians. And you know, it was so significant to see that as part of the announcement in August of 2020 by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed of normalization with Israel, as spelled out in the editorial by Ambassador Al-Ataiba, that there would be a freeze in the notion of annexing more of the West Bank by Israel. That connection of progress on the Palestinian front to normalization by Arab states with Israel, we want to get back to that. We want to get back to that connection. Israel can move forward with greater normalization, with greater acceptance. It will signal to the public in Israel that there can be a different future with its neighbors than they have experienced over decades. I'm counting on that as a way to move forward and as having an influence on the democratic society of Israel that it should feel the confidence to be able to move forward and to relax some of its anxieties, some of its justified concerns about the intentions of their Palestinian neighbors. It was so clear for so many years that isolating Israel, ignoring Israel, pretending that Israel didn't exist, condemning Israel was not advancing the cause of Palestinian rights, was not helping the Palestinian people. Engaging Israel, providing some kind of political leverage in Israel, is the way to help the Palestinian brothers of the Arab world. Now that we're seeing more of that kind of open engagement, I am hoping, I am expecting, after the trauma of October 7th, 2023 recedes, that there will be the possibility of going back to the notion that this will provide the moderate voices of the Arab world having some influence on the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian public, but also on the Israeli public to move toward a better future.
Given what we just discussed, as well as the signals being given by the incoming administration, is it realistic to expect over the next 4 years an expansion of the Abraham Accords in this environment?
I think it is. I think it depends on whether, after the conflict is over in Gaza, or at least, yes, basically after the actual grind of war is behind us, and I think that will happen sometime in the coming months, for a different conversation to take place about a political path forward. I heard from an important Saudi source just last week that it will be necessary for the leadership in Israel to be able to use the word state in some formulation as a way of allowing the Saudis to be able to move forward, following the path of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed toward normalization with Israel. It was not so clear that that was a necessity 2 years ago. It seemed that there was an openness in Riyadh to, as you know, this deal that would be an enhanced security relationship with the United States, access to the full nuclear cycle, and normalization with Israel, without the necessity of Palestinian statehood, but with something vaguer about political rights for the Palestinians. It seems that that impression has hardened in Riyadh, and there is now something demanded of Israel that's greater than what was 2 years ago, in light of the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza over the last year. Whether you can see an Israeli government in the months after the fighting ends in Gaza with a ceasefire, let's hope, still holding in the north so that the Israeli people can return to their homes, the tens of thousands who have had to evacuate northern Israel. A different mood prevailing in Israel, a feeling of greater confidence and greater security. Whether in that context there can be a different conversation about relations with their Palestinian neighbors, which will then unlock the ability for the Saudis to move forward, and then unlock the ability for other countries to follow the Saudi example as well, your example actually. I see that as possible. A lot of things have to line up. There has to be, frankly, new Palestinian leadership, less corrupt, less acquiescent to the insistence on eliminating Israel, but to actually pragmatically compromise with Israel on land, and a greater sense of security on the part of the Israelis. If we could get all of that in motion, and I'm confident that the Trump administration will want very much to get that in motion to build the legacy of President Trump, who, after all, was the author of the Abraham Accords in partnership with His Highness Sheikh Mohammed and King Hamad and King Mohammed. I think it's possible. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it, but I think it's possible. And that's certainly the direction that we're going to be pushing. And I'm expecting it's the direction that your leadership will be pressing for as well, because we should not have to live with perpetual conflict and instability and denial of rights in this region. It should not be the future that we give to our grandchildren.
Definitely, definitely. Let's touch a little bit on medium and long-term societal shifts before opening the floor to the audience. There seems to be a shift inside American Jewish society. In a February poll by the Pew Research Center, almost a third of American Jews did not agree with the way Israel is conducting the war in Gaza. Younger generations exhibit a much larger percentage of disapproval and perhaps even a disconnect with Israel. What does this mean going forward for American Jews' solidarity with Israel and its impact on U.S. foreign policy?
You're just full of easy questions, aren't you? By the way, I should say that I'm joined here by colleagues from AJC, and I'm monopolizing this conversation. I hope you'll give Ambassador Mark Sievers and Riva Gorelik an opportunity to jump in as well and even disagree with me. But I'll start on this one. First of all, let me point out that the support for Israel in the United States does not depend on the Jewish community. We're 2% of the American population. There is overwhelming support in the United States for Israel's security, Israel's well-being, Israel's partnership with the United States, the alliance of values that the United States shares with Israel. And also support for the efforts that have been made in this region to normalize relations, to integrate Israel into the region. We are a tiny community with a very loud voice, but we're a small community. The general public in America is supportive of this. So keep that in mind. And within our community, which is well integrated in American society, very much a part of the fabric of America, you have the same influences on our children as are on the children of others in our country. They see the same media. They see the same horrible pictures from Gaza. They grew up, the young generation, in an era in which Israel was not the underdog attacked by its neighbors, which is the generation that I grew up in and that Mark grew up in, but not the generation that Riva grew up in. In her generation, Israel was the dominant power in the region. So if you're a young person who is idealistic and wants to identify with the powerless over the powerful, it is natural that this would be the tendency, that there would be declining support for the great power of tiny Israel against its far more numerous neighbors. So that's not surprising to me. How does that change? It will continue to change, I believe, as the region evolves into a more integrated future, which is what you're pressing for and what we're pressing for, and which would serve the Palestinian people as much as it will serve the Israeli public. But we're in a period right now where it's very difficult to imagine how we get to that point until we're able to end the terrorist threat that Israel faces, end the Iranian threat that you face and that Israel faces, and build a future in which Israelis and Palestinians can live together, find some kind of a workable compromise, some kind of a two-state solution that doesn't threaten Israel, that provides rights for the Palestinian people. That will change the impression that young American Jews and young Americans generally have of an Israel that is part of the neighborhood. But understand the huge propaganda that Iran has generated and that enemies of Israel have been generating for decades. It will take years to sort that out and to change the impressions, but I believe that we can move in that direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jason, for this fruitful conversation. Unfortunately, our time is up. It's been a pleasure having you here, sir. Thank
It's been
you
a
very
great
much.
honor to be here. Thank you
Thank
very
you very
much.
much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.